Today, I want to walk you guys through the process of making an ambient style 1975 track, almost like the deluxe version of the black and white self-titled album. If you've never heard them before, they sound like this.
Don't call me a man. I'm not pulling all the way to be a doctor.
So this is a song that I released and sang on. It's an ambient version of a track I released called Walking on Me, and I just wanted to make something in that like 1975 ambient style. And so I thought I would share some of my insights. One of the first things that I noticed was mic choice. For this kind of track, I found that the best mic was not the SM7B or like my studio condenser microphone. It was actually this Sennheiser handheld mic that's normally just like a stage microphone. It's basically their version of like an SM58. And what I noticed is my live performance got insanely better vocally when I held it like this and I was like almost walking around my room. For some reason, the takes just kind of got magically better. Also, because of the frequency response of this microphone, I don't know, it just adds this live vibe that's really hard to pin down, other than the fact that these microphones tend to have a pretty universal frequency response and it just sounds more alive. So that's what I used to track all the vocals. I also did this thing where I just did one take running through it, and then if I had a part that I messed up, I just stopped, went back a couple of bars, and then proceeded, not overthinking it too much. I'm just using my regular vocal chain for this guy. I did have to add a little bit of an extra noise gate to it. Also, you do have to be very protective of your frequencies, especially the low end and sort of lower mid-range, because that is like a live mic. You do get a bit of a proximity effect to it.
You wanna relive the memories.
You can see it's just kind of meant to like pull it down whenever it gets a little bit too boxy or woofy. Another thing that I noticed a lot in these songs is almost like a megaphone effect, which for that I have this phone preset that I pull up in FabFilter Pro Q3, and then I bring these filters either a little bit lower or a little bit higher. It really depends on like the texture you're trying to get out of it, like how much body do you want in it and how much high end do you want out of it. So I just automated this megaphone effect to come in on some of these like vocal ad libs.
Had enough.
Megaphone comes in. Just gives it this fun texture. Similar to what I've said before, whenever you have like big spacey reverbs, you really have to watch out for your mid-range and how that's interacting with your vocal. So I'm pretty much all of my vocal sends and even my instrument sends, I have them ducking dynamically to the mid-range of my main vocal, so that this sort of 500 range and maybe a little bit brighter or lower, mainly focused on the vocal, because it can be really easy for an ambient track like this to really swallow up the vocal. Next thing I did was I added a vocoder. So that sounds like this. So a couple things you can hear. First, I'm not playing the chords of the song. I'm just kind of pedaling between the root chord of the key that we're in, and then the middle finger is kind of going between the third of the scale and the second of the scale. I'm using vocal synth for this. Here's what it sounds like. Really, I'm just trying to add this sort of like chordal meat specifically to the vocals. In songs like this, normally they have a pad going, but I didn't feel like it needed one, so making the vocals a little bit wider helped out a lot. I also band passed it, so I'm not just letting everything through. The high end was kind of sharp and the body was kind of sharp, so I really wanted these sort of spiky resonant things happening to accentuate that vocal, because when you add the effects on it, it has the potential to be really muddy, step on the main vocal and take up that whole space. So I think EQing it is really important. But yeah, with our effects, this is what the main vocal and the vocoder sound like.
Don't call me a man. I'm not pulling all my way to be a doctor.
You can also tell, like, the more I'm pushing vocally, the more the vocoder is reacting. So that's another way to sort of like subliminally add energy to different sections of the song. Another thing that I found was kind of a staple of tracks like this is really ambient guitar patches. So for this patch, I'm just using my 335 and playing a lot of open voicings, really focusing on the higher strings. Again, not really playing chords, just drones that are in key and are focused mainly on like major pentatonic stuff. So if I turn off the effects, you can hear that it sounds like this. I feel like the bridge pickup is really good for these kinds of sounds because you do want that sort of brightness to trigger reverbs and things like that. Brighter, a little bit more gritty than what you would think. Main reason I'm doing that is because if you make it really warm and round and mid-range heavy, that's the stuff that like really triggers a reverb in the wrong way. That's what makes like super reverby tracks sort of over dominate a mix, is like too much mid-range. And I already knew that there was going to be stuff in that range in this track, so I just tried to like scoot it a little bit higher up the frequency range into more of that like 4K range, which can get harsh, but it was a bit closer to what I was looking for. So after this patch, I'm running into this thing that I made in VCV Rack. So I'll just go from left to right and just describe what the patch is. We have this flux patch, which is just like a modulation tremolo thing. It's on like 30% here. If I turn it up. Adding modulation at the beginning of like a really reverby patch like this is really great because it'll add a bunch of these like little pitch modulation things happening, and when you throw that into a reverb, it like sort of blurs the note into something that's a bit thicker because the pitch is going up and down and up and down. And when you throw that into a reverb and it elongates all of it out, it just kind of becomes this big solid block of reverb. After that flux, we're going into this texture synth module, which is just a version of Mutable Instruments Clouds, which sounds like this. You can hear it's like really stuttering everything, and it also has this like very big sky ambient texture that it adds to it. And then all of that goes into Plateau, which is probably one of my favorite reverbs in VCV Rack. And it just kind of becomes this like cascade of ambience. If you're interested in learning more about guitar patches like these, I would highly recommend checking out Andy Othling and his channel and the music he puts out under Lowercase Noises. He was my introduction into the world of ambient guitar patches, and he does a lot of stuff that's more pedal based instead of Euro rack based. But yeah, if you are feeling like you want to scratch the itch of diving into this a little bit more, I would highly recommend his channel because a lot of the techniques that he teaches are things that you can apply to any sort of digital patch you're doing, and it doesn't require you to have physical guitar pedals. But then high pass it a little bit. Like I said, low end and low mids are like the things that make these tracks unbearable. So if I turn off this filter, then I turn it on, there's this whole like lower tonality to it that is cool when you're playing this by itself, but when you're playing in the context of a mix, it's a little bit too much. On the opposite end of guitar patches, we have this guy. Which I played using my Strat. And as you can hear, it's meant to be like almost the opposite texture of this guy. It's still a little drivey, but this is a lot more of like that glassy tone, whereas this has a lot of like grit and gnarliness to it. So if you're adding like different sections with different guitar parts, I'm making sure you're thinking of guitar tones as like almost contrasting elements can be really helpful. So I started out with the Brainworks flanger going into Neural DSP Rabia. Was a little glassy, so I pulled out some of those resonant guys and then high passed it and threw it into a limiter. And then underneath that, we have these guys, which are these ambient generative patches. Which you can hear is really weird. These are not a pre-programmed sequence, so every time I render this song out in the beginning and you hear this track, it's actually completely different every single time I render the song out, which is kind of cool. I feel like these arpeggiated synths or these like ARP synths that are going on 16th or 8th notes, a large portion of the movement of these tracks is going to come from that. When we get to the drums, you'll see there's not a whole lot happening. I feel like if you're going to make a style of track like this, going for synths that are your main movements, like your main meter that like keeps you on time, having your guitars be more strummed out and held out, I think that's the way to go, and then have your drums be super stripped. But yeah, this patch is just this Nowhere preset from Ignition Keys. And the way I'm adding that sort of generative character to it is this rack that I've made in Ableton, which is really simple. We have this major 7th chord rack, which just makes everything sound terrible. But then that runs it into the arpeggiator. So you can see there's like this movement happening. Problem is it's not in key and it's a little too predictable. It's very much so to fix that, we're using this random module here, which adds a 55% chance that it's going to not be the note that you plug into it. So anytime this like little yellow dot next to the 0 blinks, it's just letting through the notes that these two modules are generating. And anytime there's a plus sign, it's just doing a different random note going up. So a little bit more than 50-50, but yeah, the one that makes it sound good is this guy here at the end. This is the major pentatonic scales module, which is going to quantize all of the MIDI notes to be in major pentatonic scale E major, which is what I've said is my bass. So yeah, that's how you make generative patches. Another thing that really helps is this preset has a wonky replica thing that's like making it sort of like pitch shifty and bendy. So if I turn that off, you can hear just the reverb tails are just whatever the last note was. But when I turn on this replica module, like they sort of like pitch wise sort of bend up and down. And then for other sections, I have this guy here, which is basically the same thing, but on a slightly different preset and an octave up from this previous patch, which when I turn off the filter sounds like this. And with this patch, I knew I wanted to get like those annoying resonant frequencies popping out. So I bandpassed it to be like anything between 380 and 650. And then when you throw that into reverb, it's very soft and glidey. If you want, you can also use this with a little bit of auto pan. I think that can make it sound really cool. Another thing that you'll notice in tracks of this style is they make a lot of use out of filter automation. You can almost make one instrument sound like a completely different instrument if you just use filters. So in the intro, this ARP keys is really open. But then as it transitions down to the verse, it filters out low. Which in the context of the song makes it feel really cool and like something's degrading. Also, if you're gonna do those kind of filter sweeps, I recommend having like a really steep curve because synthesizers are not the same as EQs. And while, yes, technically having a less sharp slope reduces phase and stuff like that, on a synthesizer, normally they're gonna look like this. Just by default, like the 24 dB slopes are gonna be almost always the default. Another thing about these kinds of tracks is their bass patches are stupid simple. It's like very pure and synthetic. So this is a sound that I found in FM8. It has a lot of the low end that I'm looking for when I need like a sub, but it's also got a little bit like the upper harmonics, so it doesn't completely disappear like on somebody's phone. Yeah, people sleep on FM8 a little bit too much. It's a really cool synth. It's almost like a really, really powerful version of like a DX7. Honestly, a lot of the presets that come with it are pretty cool in terms of sound design. So I just have two of these guys going. I have a low octave. That's just made to sort of shake the room, and then I have an upper octave. Almost chiptune-y, but when you combine them together, you get this really thick bass that pops out of the mix and you can hear it audibly, but it also will like rattle the room. And you can almost get this like weird effect of like a bass player playing up an octave and then introducing a lower octave where it just suddenly has more meat, but still maintaining that octave range.
Again and again.
Then they both come in.
Don't call me mad.
It just has this really cool texture. It just adds beef to this section. And then we have a couple of drum racks. Again, we are not using anything really crazy in terms of drums for this song. I basically just made MIDI and split it out into two separate instruments. So the first one we have is this guy, which is our kick and snare. So for this style of music, you're going to want something that's not a snare per se, something that's a little bit more trappy tends to work best. For this track, I used this oversampled volcano rim. And then I did a little bit of auto filter just to try to get that like the resonant frequency of that. And then I threw it into a ROM reverb. And then the kick is pretty aggressive. The thing you'll notice here is I actually cut off the transient at the start of this just because I felt like the initial kick samples transient was like made for an EDM or a trap kit and it was kind of aggressive. So I just chopped off the beginning of it so I could get like almost like the sub knock from it. And then also your nightmare when mixing stuff like this is going to be the mastering stage. And so I would recommend giving yourself a little bit of a break and high passing the kick because you're gonna be struggling to get the kick to feel like it's loud enough and like it's knocking the track, but at the same time also not clipping your master. If you want to have fun mixing these drums, I highly recommend using like a clipper just to like soften that kick actually. And then underneath that, we have a couple of these guys. And under that, we have this percussion layer. Basically just wanted to add some cool ear candy stuff that I thought would work well in this context. So I have this guy, which is this perk workout sample. And it had a little bit of a meter to it, so I just bandpassed it and then threw it into this ROM reverb, but I am using like a shorter like studio drums preset. Mixing and matching long and short reverbs is going to make certain elements stand out more than others. So yeah, it just adds a fun little like meter thing. It's not quantized to the actual BPM of the song, but because it just kind of plays consistently, this like it just kind of feels like it is. And then there's this tambourine, which is running into this H delay on this dotted eighth preset. Just like little percussion things that come in on like the last chorus because it's actually not present for a majority of the track. And then I mastered this track outside of this session, so I just threw a limiter on here for now to bring it up to volume. But yeah, here's what everything sounds like together.
Don't call me love. I'm not pulling on my way to be a doctor. Feel like punching your face. Think we've had enough. Think we've had enough.
But yeah, that's what the track sounds like. I honestly think a lot of people should look into making these style of tracks more often. I think for the indie pop world, they're a lot more interesting than like an acoustic version of a song. I think you could do something really cool where maybe if you have like a bunch of releases and a bunch of songs and you're like prepping for future releases and you want to release some stuff in the meantime, try making like some ambient versions of songs that you've already done. I think it can be a really cool texture and I think it blends pretty well into the world of indie pop. But yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I'll be talking to you guys next week.